Concentration camps were one of the most brutal and bloodthirsty tools used by the Nazis during World War II. These spaces received thousands of prisoners who were subjected to the most incredible atrocities in history, places where there was no mercy and death was common. Hunger and pain were present daily to such an extent that suffering became the most loyal companion of the people confined in the different camps throughout Germany and the lands under its control. However, there was one that was special. We are talking about Ravensbrück, the only one exclusively for women, and which had the particularity of not being occupied mainly by Jews, but was the final destination of the political prisoners of the Third Reich. In this new military history video, we will learn what life was like in this ruthless Nazi camp. Stay with us to find out.
We saw some very thin women file past, dragging themselves along with shovels on their backs. It was a terrible shock because they were in such a state. It made you wonder, who on earth are these women? Where are we? You never imagined you would become the same.
These women must have done some appalling things to be treated in such a way. They looked awful to us. Some of them, who were French, called to us, "You'll soon look like us."
Contrary to popular belief, the history of Nazi concentration camps began long before World War II. The economic depression of 1929 destabilized the Weimar Republic, and while the collapse of the regime that governed Germany began, the figure of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party grew. Finally, in 1933, the Führer came to power, and with him came several practices designed to have absolute control of the country. Among them, the existence of confinement spaces where tens of thousands of opponents of the ideology of the new leader were taken prisoner. Any pretext was good to stop the different groups, since, although they were mostly members of the German Communist Party, there were also criminals, asocials, and Jews. It is presumed that the first concentration camp was established in the city of Nora on March 3, 1933, in the facilities of a school. But they soon multiplied throughout the country, always under the command of the SS, the paramilitary organization at Hitler's service, which was commanded by one of the people he trusted the most, Heinrich Himmler. The legal basis for the arrests was the practice called protective custody, which meant restricting a person's freedom for their own protection or during an emergency. With this policy, the number of prisoners increased rapidly, and new camps were born to hold them. By the end of the first year in which they operated, 80% of the inmates were communists, 10% were social democrats, and the remaining 10% were affiliated with other parties, were union activists, or had no connection to a political space. However, at that time one could see a peculiarity in the large group that was captured and repressed in an attempt to bring it closer to Nazi ideology. They were all men.
Himmler was convinced that by assembling these prisoners in the regenerative forests of the Reich, the Aryan race would be purified. Up until 1937, women had been less targeted by his policy.
We're dealing with a society that imagines itself as virile, and so there's a very strong idea that women don't think, and therefore do not represent any political danger, which explains why between 33 and 37, the Nazis didn't do anything much against women.
But from 1937 on, the wind changed.
With a new approach, where the female gender had achieved greater participation in society, the concentration camps began to show a growth in the number of female prisoners, and that led to the idea of an exclusive space for them. At the beginning of 1938, Himmler began planning a camp for women considered deviant. This classification included prostitutes, abortionists, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and of course, communists and Jews. For this purpose, He chose a place near the town of Ravensbrück in the picturesque Mecklenburg Lake District, an hour from Berlin, where one of his best friends from the SS had a rest home. The works for the construction of the new confinement site were carried out by male prisoners who were sent from another camp, Sachsenhausen. They worked tirelessly, in the worst conditions, and brutally subjected by the Nazi forces to finish the job as soon as possible. Many of them died of hunger and exhaustion while carrying out this task, but the SS members did not care. The most important thing for them was that by the first months of 1939, they had already set up their camp in Ravensbrück, and on May 15th of that year, the first 867 women arrived there. It is true that the violent war had not yet begun, but the apparatus set up by the Führer already had a large network prepared for what was to come.
May 1939, Germany. The Second World War had not yet broken out. Nonetheless, the Third Reich was rolling out a huge secret operation across the whole German territory. Hitler's trains and trucks crossed the country, loaded with prisoners who were political opponents or Germans and Austrians deemed unworthy of the Aryan race.
With the arrival of the battle, the number of enemies of the Nazis increased. Now it was not only limited to rivals of their ideology on German soil, but to opponents throughout Europe. In addition, Jews were one of the main targets of Hitler as a threat to his defense of the race, so they quickly became the majority within the groups of prisoners in the concentration camps. However, Ravensbrück was different. That space, which had as its first commander the SS Colonel Günther Tomaszka, had a very marked peculiarity determined by the gender of the inmates. They were all women. But in addition, the origin of the prisoners detained there also broke with the normality of the other camps. The largest group consisted of 40,000 Polish women, and another important group included 27,000 Jews from various countries, about 18,000 Russians, 8,000 French, and 1,000 Dutch. However, despite these figures, more than 80% of the prisoners in this camp were political prisoners. Continuing with the number of people who were taken to Ravensbrück, we get closer to what the living conditions were like in this camp, since Himmler had been warned from the beginning that it could hold a maximum of 50,000 inmates. However, despite knowing this figure, the place ended up grotesquely overcrowded by the more than 130,000 prisoners who ended up locked up there. Although the Nazis worked to enlarge the place and equip it with new and fearsome spaces, the occupants of the camp could not escape the overcrowding.
The brand new camp at the time comprised 16 dormitory shacks, 2 workshop blocks, the Kommandantur guard quarters, showers, kitchens, and the infirmary called the Revier. The 9 square kilometer site was ringed by a wall 4 meters high, topped with electrified barbed wire. As the roundups continued, the number of dormitory blocks doubled to 32. The Nazis also built a bunker containing 80 cells, 1 gas chamber, and a building to house 3 crematorium ovens.
Equipped in this way, Ravensbrück functioned in a similar way to most large Nazi concentration camps, and daily life there was extremely harsh. The meager food and inadequate housing reached unbearable levels with the constant influx of prisoners. In addition, this camp was also a place of work, and all inmates who were healthy enough to perform any kind of work were forced to spend 12 hours a day carrying out physically demanding tasks. Many of them even performed duties in a factory run by Siemens, to which they were taken during the day. In addition, routine selections were made to eliminate those women who were not fit for these exhausting jobs. Despite these strict characteristics, the tens of thousands of people interned at Ravensbrück managed to establish support networks over the years. They secretly took part in religious services, took part in many cultural productions, committed acts of sabotage in factories, and worked to save the lives of their sick comrades. This was largely achieved thanks to the progress of the war. In the first months of the camp's existence, when the prison population was still quite small, it became relatively easy for the SS to maintain strict control over the prisoners' daily lives. At that time, it was difficult even to meet up with other inmates during the few free hours. Occasionally, some women managed to escape despite the great risk to which they were exposed, and recited poetry, discussed politics, or sang in small groups somewhere far from the blocks of rooms. However, once the war began, even though daily life worsened in terms of food and living conditions, the SS also reduced the level of control. It was more difficult to keep track of the movement of all the prisoners, and this reduced the punishment for relatively minor infractions, such as not carrying out an order exactly as the soldiers intended. The high number of German-speaking women in the camp also facilitated the development of cultural activities, since the guards, who were mostly female, tended to be more lenient with them. At this time, it was almost a blessing not to be Jewish, since with the war in full swing, treatment of that particular group became harsher.
Political prisoner was much better. Mind you, many of them were killed or died just the same, but not as automatically as when you were Jewish. There was no question about not being sent to Auschwitz.
It is true that Ravensbrück had many artists and intellectuals among its population. Particularly notable were the large number of educated Polish women sent there, as well as groups of Czech students. Cultural activity among women usually began in the initial quarantine phase, when the new arrivals were not allowed to leave their precarious dormitories for several weeks. Many composed poems, which they memorized in their heads and recorded on scraps of paper. Others managed to put together leaflets containing songs and drawings by the inmates, and there was even music composition. However, these small glimpses of humanity that characterized this particular Nazi camp were only momentary. As in the rest of the spaces prepared for prisoners of the German forces, there was always the time for atrocities. The female exclusivity opened the possibility for different things within Ravensbrück, such as setting up the main training camp for female SS guards. From there emerged some of the most infamous and brutal figures of the Third Reich, such as Dorothea Binz. This was one of the bloodiest Nazis. She found her true calling within this camp when she began to take charge of the tortures in the punishment bunker. The sadistic German enjoyed tormenting any inmate who was caught disobeying the rules, even if it was the aforementioned meetings with other prisoners to talk about politics. No matter what the offense was, training had taught this guard to be relentless. She now knew how to inflict pain on her victims and often beat them to death. On one occasion, she saw an exhausted prisoner fall to the ground. She approached, slapped her, and then took an axe to dismember her. After killing her, she noticed that her boot had been stained with blood, so she bent down to cut a piece of the deceased's dress and clean them. This was one type of violence that women experienced in Ravensbrück, but it was not the only one. Male guards were also lethal and often added rape to this, forcing inmates into prostitution. As a result of sexual relations, many prisoners became pregnant and had children who were confined to the same cruel fate.
The Nazis, according to their whim, would sometimes pluck a child from one block or another, and that child would never be seen again. Every evening when she returned from work, Mama anxiously wondered, will I find my little children waiting for me?
Children were particularly vulnerable during the Holocaust. The Nazis justified their murder as part of the racial struggle. or as a preventive security measure, saying that they would be a danger to the Third Reich in the future. In this way, the Germans and their collaborators killed children for these ideological reasons, and often also in retaliation for attacks by their parents. Approximately 1.5 million children were executed during the Second World War, a number that includes Jews, Roma or Gypsies, German children with physical and mental disabilities, Poles, and those living in the occupied Soviet Union. This was one of the cruelest aspects that the prisoners of Ravensbrück could see with their own eyes, and the survivors made this clear when they recalled it.
I entered this room and was appalled to find newborns piled up on the beds where they were being kept. They looked like little old men. It was horrific.
That was one thing for which I could never forgive the Germans. The children in the camps, the things we saw.
The technique of starvation had already been tried by the Nazis. In Ravensbrück, it was applied to babies and their mothers.
Now, if slavery and torture weren't enough for you, Ravensbrück also received transports bound for the gas chambers. The train arrived packed with Jewish people who were sent to this place for extermination. They were locked in a room, and a powerful cyanide-based pesticide was thrown on them that killed them in a short time. This was not something exclusive to this concentration camp, but it added to the brutality that women suffered in its facilities, as was the case with the gruesome medical experiments. One of the most notorious involved the SS surgeon, Karl Gebhardt. In 1942, he was sent to Prague at Himmler's request, since one of the Führer's most trusted men was seriously ill. He was one of the high-ranking Nazis, Reinhard Heydrich, whose life the medical professional was supposed to save. Despite the recommendations to use a particular treatment for the convalescent commander's infections, Gebhardt ignored it and looked for another way, but his efforts were in vain. Heydrich died and Hitler became furious. The tense atmosphere that followed this experience made the SS surgeon want to demonstrate that the option he had rejected was not going to work. So he decided to use the prisoners of Ravensbrück as an example. To do this, he made cuts in the victims and placed earth or glass on them to generate large infections that would then be subjected to the effect of the drugs.
To preserve his reputation, Gebhardt set out to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of sulfonamide, a forerunner of antibiotics, on gangrene. And Ravensbrück would be the arena of his medical experiments. These were carried out in the Revier, the infirmary block, a double building covering 1,500 square meters, connected by a corridor comprising 20 rooms, including 7 wards for the hospitalization of inmates, an operating theater, an examination room, and offices.
Gebhardt was not alone in this space. He was joined by Herta Oberhäuser, a Nazi nurse who enjoyed removing and reimplanting body parts from children and women to check their degree of recovery with the use of the same treatments. Her sadism reached such a point that most of them died in the operating room, and those who survived suffered serious after effects for the rest of their lives. Another of the tests in which she participated aimed to break part of the limbs of these guinea pigs to check how the nerve muscle regeneration occurred, or if a transplant was necessary. Previously, they hit them with a hammer or a chisel, then they sewed the affected parts, and, after a reasonable time, they reopened the wounds to check the results. This is how the infirmary block became the terror of the prisoners.
They took me into the operating theater in a wheelchair. I had no idea why I was being taken there. They injected us with a liquid. We were laid down, completely drowsy. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. We were in good health.
The experimentation seemed to have no limits, and the little ones were not excluded either. Children were injected with oil to extract their vital organs and bones while they were still alive. An extremely painful process that led to death in less than 5 minutes. Those who survived the cruel technique were still killed by Oberheiser, who injected them with gasoline in the arm. Thus, whatever the age of the prisoner who passed through the hands of these two infamous characters, the result ended up being the same: a brutal and merciless death.
I was that scared to go to the doctor, because if you were going to be sent to the Riviera, that they might inject you, and that's how people died.
After learning about all these atrocities, we are left with the final destination of Ravensbrück, which was the main supplier of women to the brothels established in many major Nazi camps towards the end of the war. While it was not unusual for female prisoners to be raped by guards in these places, brothels also existed as a method of control and reward for male detainees, and especially for homosexuals, as they were forced to have relations with someone of the female sex, believing that this would cure them of what the Germans understood as a deviation. Often the victims of these practices volunteered for these positions in the hope of avoiding the harder physical labor and perhaps receiving better food rations, but most died quickly due to sexual abuse and the rampant spread of venereal diseases. With the fall of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, perhaps they thought these treatments would end, but the survivors of Ravensbrück who were liberated by Red Army forces were also victims of Soviet war crimes, as they were raped by their supposed saviors. So we are coming to the end, and we can say that this concentration camp probably did not have the same impact as others like Auschwitz, but that does not mean that it was not just as bloody for its occupants. Throughout World War II, between 5,000 and 6,000 women died in the gas chamber built in the camp. In addition, it is estimated that another 50,000 died from cold, hunger, shootings, beatings, lethal injections, and various diseases. Ravensbrück may not have been etched into the Western visual imagination either, since unlike the liberation of other camps, it was not filmed or documented with iconic photographs. In fact, it doesn't quite fit into the history of the Holocaust either, as it was mostly the destination of political prisoners. However, it has left stories of pain and suffering as indelible marks on tens of thousands of lives that suffered Nazi brutality there. Now, after having learned everything about the only concentration camp exclusively for women in the Third Reich, it is time to say goodbye. But first, we would like to know what you think. Which do you think is the most brutal camp created by the Germans? Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We hope to meet you again in our next video.